and thank you for being here for our third lecture in a series of 5. This is our 30th annual Whitehall Lecture Series. My name is John Blades, and I'm the director of the Flagler Museum. I should start by apologizing for the cancellation last week. James Percoco was due to come here last Sunday to talk about the Lincoln Memorial, but he couldn't get out of Washington, D.C. The weather wouldn't let his plane out from the airport, so we had a last-minute cancellation. He will come to join the series just in a different order. He'll be here, I think, March 22nd, and that'll be our final lecture. That's never happened to us before in all the years of doing this lecture series, so we've been pretty lucky so far. Next week's lecture, in the meantime, will be on Mount Rushmore, and we'll have David Wolf here to give that lecture. And let me just take a second to remind you to turn off your cell phones or anything else that could go beep. And if you happen to make it into the room with an audio tour wand, would you hold that up so the staff can collect that from you? The AV system here will set off the internal alarm on those audio tour wands, and they'll really get your attention. I want to thank the museum staff for their work behind the scenes to put these lecture series together and to handle the logistics for these lecture series. And I want to thank those who've joined us online for this lecture. All of our lectures can be joined live online via the museum's website. And when you join us online, you get to see the same pictures all of you are seeing here in the grand ballroom, as well as hear the live audio and even submit questions. So it's a great way to join the lecture even if you're not in town. Let's see, what else do I need to announce? You've got at each of your seats the season program guide. That is the guide to all of our programming this season, so I hope to see you here for other programs at the museum throughout the season and even throughout the spring and summer for the rest of the year. In fact, that guide is your guide to what's going on in the museum. Let's see, what else is there? I think that's about it. I'll be talking on, well, let me just give you some background first. You know, we started this year's theme thinking just about the fact that so many of the great monuments in our country were constructed during the Gilded Age, conceived or constructed during the Gilded Age, and wondering why that was and what that was about, and thinking about it. And as we talked more and more about it internally, we began to realize that the monuments that we hold dearest in most cases are those that represent different aspects of the American character. And then, in fact, those aspects of the American character are represented in Mount Rushmore, the last of the great monuments, and probably the largest and most permanent of the monuments. So we thought, well, let's build a lecture series around those monuments and around the character, the aspects of the American character that they represent. So, for example, we've already enjoyed a lecture on the Washington Monument, described by our lecturer as a frozen ray of the sun. It's obviously an obelisk, and I think this is a great description. And the fact that really the aspect of the American character that Washington represents is our manifest destiny, our God-given destiny, our spiritual side of America. And here he is, sort of surrounded by 13 angels representing 13 states about to ascend into heaven. So he's really the father of this country, godlike father of the country. We enjoyed a lecture a couple of weeks ago, talked about the Jefferson Memorial, and the fact that Jefferson, this open arcade temple, Roman temple, Jefferson represents the intellectual side of America. He was part of the Enlightenment. He really paid attention to the Enlightenment. He wrote our Constitution. He really was, in many ways, the brains behind the foundations of our country. And we'll end our lecture series talking about the Lincoln Memorial with James Percoco, and the fact that Lincoln is sort of the conscience of America and represented as such in this great temple where he's seated and overlooking back at the Capitol, across the mall, across the reflecting pool. And the site nowadays where we go to have our rallies and have our discussions about who we should be as Americans and what our conscience is. And then we'll actually do this lecture next week on the Mount Rushmore, where all four of these figures, including the one I'm talking about today, Teddy Roosevelt, are carved out of the side of a mountain. And why those four presidents out of all that we've had so far. So our task today is to talk about Theodore Roosevelt, who really represents the muscular, physical, active, powerful side of the American character in a way that no other president could even come close to. So here's a picture of Theodore. I have to tell you though, I'm a little bit ambivalent about talking about Theodore because he and Henry Flagler were not great friends, not bosom buddies. Henry Flagler had some problems that he felt like were caused by Roosevelt. Of course, Roosevelt was anxious to bust up the trusts that he saw as bad trusts, who were bloated with money, and he was trying to figure out how to make sure that the sovereign power, the head of the sovereign nation, as he was as president eventually, could maintain the ultimate authority in the country. He was where the corporations were gaining the ultimate authority. And he had cause to worry about that because in 1914, America minted its first billionaire, a guy named John D. Rockefeller. The federal budget in 1914 was $725 million. So we had a man of such wealth in America in 1914 that he could have funded the entire nation for 1 year and a quarter, just on his personal fortune alone. If we fast forward 100 years, certainly not the case. 100 years later, the federal government's budget is more than 4,000 times bigger than it was in 1914, and yet there are no 4 trillionaires. You'd have to have, if you had you had an American today that had the same kind of wealth Rockefeller had in 1914 compared to the federal government, you'd have to have a 5 trillionaire among today's citizens, and there are no 5 trillionaires, there are 1 trillionaires, there are no 1/10 of a trillionaire. So the 500-pound gorilla in our economy has become the federal government, not the corporations, not the wealthy. It's completely changed. But in Roosevelt's day, that wasn't the case. He was certainly worried, and so he developed this reputation as a trust buster, and here he is taking on, this is the infant Hercules taking on Standard Oil, and the heads of the serpents are Rockefeller and Flagler. He was worried that they were going to take over the country, these big corporations. And in fact, Standard Oil became the wealthiest and most profitable corporation in the world and remained so for over a century. Of course, Flagler ran into some trouble with Roosevelt when he started the Oversea Railroad project, building his bridges down to Key West. He was taken to task by the United States Attorney General by order of Theodore Roosevelt for peonage, for taking workers and keeping them prisoners. This was thrown out by the courts because there was just no merit to the charge. This is, by the way, is a handbill used for recruiting workers. Flagler was trying to figure out how to get 4,000 workers on the job and keep the workforce up to build this railroad. And so he hired agents to work the major cities in the Caribbean and even in Europe to try to bring in workers. They were paid $1.50 a day, the average worker. Doesn't sound like a lot by today's standards, but by comparison, if you worked for the Secret Service at this time in history, you were paid $3 a day. So it doesn't sound so bad when you put it into context. And at the same time, I think we all know that Theodore Roosevelt, in September of 1901, decided to rename the Executive Mansion and to call it the White House, which I've always found really interesting because Flagler's plans to build his home here in Palm Beach were published at that point and known, and of course Flagler was calling his home Whitehall. So it makes you wonder. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt hired McKim, Mead and White, or actually Charles Follen McKim, to redo the entire interior of the White House into a Beaux-Arts style interior, the way we know today, and much the same kind of look you see here at Whitehall. So you really wonder what was going on and just how much these two were paying attention to each other. Let's get back to Teddy. I love this picture of him. He's probably just trying to see beyond his glasses. He didn't have great eyesight. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about with regard to Roosevelt is going to be illustrated through cartoons, through illustrations, centerfolds and covers of Puck magazine, Harper's magazine. This is a president that loved the media, that was very easy to caricaturize, that was such a strong personality, and tried to do so much that the media had a blast with him. But he had a good attitude about it. In fact, this is his quote. To say that, basically says that to say that there should be no criticism of the president is basically un-American. He thought it was fine. He thought it was great to criticize the president. And certainly he was one of the most criticized and most loved presidents we've had. He had an amazing career, and this cartoon illustrates some of the stages in his career as a cowboy, a historian, a police commissioner, a naval secretary, a rough rider, and of course, we know he went on to become vice president and president. But there wasn't any indication when he was a child that he was going to have such an amazing career. He was nearsighted, of course. He was asthmatic. He was homeschooled because he was sickly. He loved pulp novels, which were like the comic books of their day and were thought to be the ruination of the youth of the country. His father recognized he was kind of weakling and said to him, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. And without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. I'm giving you the tools, but it's up to you to make your body." So Theodore took that to heart and set about trying to make a strong body out of the weakling body that he had. He attended Harvard, joined the boxing team, joined the rowing team, and worked on becoming stronger and more physically fit. He would never grow taller than 5 feet 9 inches. But for the rest of his life, that boxing idea stuck with him, and so he was often caricaturized in his various pursuits as a boxer, as a tough guy. Now, he went from Harvard to Columbia to study law. He was studying biology, by the way, at Harvard. Goes on to Columbia to study law, but he leaves Columbia, he leaves his law studies to run for the New York State Assembly. And he becomes the youngest New York State Assemblyman to be elected up to that time at the age of 23. And he becomes the Speaker of the Assembly. He went after Jay Gould and the Civil Service Commission. He tried to overturn the spoils system. Back in those days, didn't have a civil service system the way we do today. The incoming administration got to sort of appoint every job in the civil service right down to the lowest level practically. Today, we know civil service is a protected class of workers and very hard to fire or replace them. But at this time in history, the civil service were appointed and a new administration could sort of wipe out the entire civil service group and start over again. Here, this is a great depiction of him as a bulldog, and it's just the kind of reputation he had. He went to work writing. He became a very prolific writer. His first book was about the Naval War of 1812. So he was on the road at the age of 23 to having a very successful career as all kinds of things, as a politician first and foremost. But unfortunately, he lost his mother and his wife on the same day in the house they all shared. And it, of course, made him step back and reflect about life and wonder what he should be doing and if he was doing the right thing. So he did what somebody like Roosevelt would do. He decided to go out to the Dakotas and be a cowboy. And this is a picture of him next to his horse. I love the stance. He kind of looks like Martin Short in the Three Amigos. That stance. But not my idea of what a cowboy looks like, but I guess maybe he was a cowboy, so maybe they look like that. It's not what we see in the Western movies. He was an avid hunter all of his life. In fact, he was a co-founder of the Boone and Crockett Club, which still exists today. Here he is with his fringed jacket on and his some kind of animal skin hat. Of course, he took lots of hunting trips. Here he is with an elephant he downed and a rhinoceros. I see some of you blanching about this because But back in this time, being a naturalist and a conservationist was not about not hunting. In fact, we all admire the amazing drawings of Audubon, thank you, of Audubon, which, by the way, he did only from preserved specimens that he'd shot. So conservationists were often as hunters as well. In fact, I love this centerfold from Puck magazine here. Here's Roosevelt at a dinner table, and he's being toasted by the bear. And the bear is at the other end of the table, and he's toasting Roosevelt, and he's saying, here's hoping that when next we meet, we see you first. We all know about this story, where he supposedly didn't shoot the bear on a hunting trip with the governor of Mississippi. And the bear's portrayed as this innocent little bear, but in fact it was an old bear that had been run down and harassed until they could tie it to a tree so that the president could say he shot a bear, but he refused to do it because he didn't think it was sportsmanlike. That doesn't mean the bear was let go. The bear was shot because he was in rough shape, and the president ordered that, Roosevelt ordered that. He just wasn't going to shoot himself. In fact, they shot the bear and took it back to camp and ate it. But the story that was handed down because of this cartoon was he did a noble thing, refused to shoot a bear, and thus somebody got the idea of naming a stuffed bear a teddy bear. Lorelei, do you have a teddy bear? Did you? Yes, she says. Okay, I think we all did. He becomes the New York City Police Commissioner. He comes back to the East, decides his cowboy stuff isn't working, and he's back in the East and as a New York City Police Commissioner, cleaning things up. And then he gets appointed as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he's basically running the Navy at this point. There's a great picture of him here at the Naval War College. By the way, he's interesting to photograph because you never know what he's going to do. Here he is with this group of people at the Naval War College. Look, he's facing off who knows what he's looking at, and he's facing off in some other direction. Everybody else is sort of posed for the picture. Then, of course, the Spanish-American War comes along, and this is a guy he's all about being physical and about war and about being active. So he decides he wants to be a part of that and manages to get himself designate a colonel. Goes off to the Spanish-American War with his nearsightedness and all, puts together a group he calls the Rough Riders, a name he took, by the way, from Buffalo Bill's group at the Columbian Exposition, which he called the World Congress of Rough Riders, back in 1893. So Roosevelt adopts that name for his group, charges up San Juan Hill, and this is one of the reasons I came to really appreciate Roosevelt, because he was such an interesting character. He's on horseback. He's the highest thing sticking up. Everybody else is dodging bullets. He's on horseback, running up the hill, trying to encourage his troops. He gets his glasses shot off, but being so nearsighted, he knew he needed to have glasses, so he kept an extra pair always, takes them off, and he's galloping still, takes one pair of glasses out of his pockets and replaces the ones that have been shot off, and he keeps going. In fact, his bravery is so astounding to everyone around him that he's awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Becomes the only president to have ever been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Of course, when he goes back into politics after the war, all that works pretty well. In fact, when he runs for governor, he's depicted as Colonel Theodore Roosevelt in uniform in the posters, in the campaign posters. And that eventually earns him the attention of the Republican Party on a national level, and he gets nominated to be the vice president, the running mate for William McKinley. In fact, his reputation was so strong and still so powerful from the Spanish-American War that this is how they depicted Roosevelt as the running mate for McKinley. There's McKinley sitting on the saddle horn, and Roosevelt's driving the horse. And he's the vice president. It kind of reminds me of the Bush-Cheney relationship in the first term of Bush. You may remember people used to joke that President Bush was only a heartbeat away from being president because Cheney was really the president. It's kind of the same relationship that Roosevelt and McKinley had. Of course, we know that President McKinley was shot at the Panama American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901. The exposition was designed and headed up. The head architects for that exposition were Carrere and Hastings, the architects who designed this home, who Flagler had given a big opportunity to when he asked them to design the Hotel Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine. and who by the time this home was being designed in 1901, along with the New York Public Library and the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, had become great society architects and very successful. We know McKinley didn't survive. Here's a cover of Leslie's Weekly showing a drawing of a funeral for McKinley. And Roosevelt becomes the youngest president to have ever assumed the office. Puck, knowing the mood of the country, decided not to make fun of Roosevelt for this cover. Instead, he's depicted as the able captain at the helm of the ship of state. He's going to lead this country and steady at the helm and calm things down. We were very worried at this time that in our history that anarchists were going to take this country apart, and if not then, perhaps the socialists. So you may recall from earlier lectures that this is a period in time when we had a tremendous number of bombings, that the McNamara brothers alone planned and executed 110 bombings during this first decade of the 20th century. So it wasn't by any means guaranteed that we were going to wind up with a stable capitalist system and a democracy as we've all enjoyed growing up in our own lives. Of course, Theodore is a man of action, and here's a great illustration of him with his favorite two words, bully and, as he said, delighted. And he sets about as president going after all the things that he believes in. He's going to fix and correct, and of course he's got the tide of public opinion with him. So he takes on the trusts. Puts into act, he really goes for it with the Sherman Antitrust Act that had been passed back in 1890. He starts going after the trusts that he considers bad trusts. He definitely made a clear distinction between good and bad trusts. He alone was the arbiter between who was a good trust or what was a good trust and what was a bad trust. First trust he goes after, a guy named J.P. Morgan, who put together a railroad trust called the Northern Securities Company. The railroad trust, that company involved, was formed in 1901 and put together by E.H. Harriman, James J. Hill, J.P. Morgan himself, of course, and John D. Rockefeller. And he goes after that trust in a big way. And, of course, people were wondering what's going on, I'm sure. By the way, J.P. Morgan, he believed in capitalism, but I don't think he believed in competition. He thought that competition was a bit of a messy and inefficient thing. So he was anxious to, as much as possible, consolidate the great industries. Wherever he could, he put his own men on the board of these corporations. Wherever he could, he'd take control of them to wring out the inefficiencies, to make them as the most efficient and productive organizations he could make them. He was able to take over Westinghouse, for example, when Westinghouse got into trouble during one of our recessions and had a little bit of a cash flow problem. Didn't have a problem with net wealth or any problem making payroll, but he went to J.P. Morgan for a loan, and J.P. Morgan refused him because J.P. Morgan thought he saw an opportunity to finally get a hold of Westinghouse's businesses, which were very profitable and always returned about 10% to the stakeholders each year in dividends. And he did succeed in getting hold of Westinghouse's primary business. Well, Theodore is out campaigning like crazy, of course. He's the first, for whatever his issue is at that time, and he becomes, as a consequence of his view of the world and the times and him being out and about as much as possible, he becomes the first president to ride in an automobile. No president up to this point had ridden in an automobile. And he also becomes the first president to fly in an airplane. Doesn't look like much of an airplane, but you can see him, he's hanging on, and he's determined, and he's got a young pilot there who's going to take him up into the air. And by the time the election rolls around, there's just no contest. There's a picture of Roosevelt sitting in his corner, relaxing, waiting for a Democratic candidate to show up that's even going to be a match. That's how popular he was. He takes the opportunity to really do a lot of other things. Here's a picture of he and John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club. Roosevelt really shows his true colors as a conservationist. He establishes the U.S. Forest Service. He creates 51 federal bird reservations, 4 national game preserves. Here's a picture of he and John Burroughs, another conservationist at Yellowstone. He creates 150 national parks, national forests, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and ends up protecting through these programs 2.3 million acres of land that he deems part of our national heritage. Truly amazing. Of course, he's a bit of an imperialist, so he's decided what's America's manifest destiny. He's taken that to heart, whatever needs to be done to put the world in order according to the way he sees it, he goes about doing. So here's him marching around the Caribbean, pulling the Great White Fleet around with him as he takes control. And one of his issues is he wants to see a canal get built. The French had tried it, they'd failed, but he believed the Americans could do it. The problem was the land that we wanted to work through to build the canal was really a province of Columbia, and they wanted a lot of money to allow us to build. So Roosevelt decides to back a separatist group, and it really was a mismatch, as you might imagine. He whispers in the Panamanian separatist group's ears that they're going to be their own country, and here's Uncle Sam with the plans for the canal under his arm, talking to the Panamanian group about how it's okay if they have this separate, we'll back them, and they'll become their own country. I'm going to skip ahead a couple images here just to show you this one. This is another picture, a cartoon on the cover of Harper's, where he's depicted as stopping the holdup perpetrated by the Colombians who wanted too much money for us to build a canal through their property, through their country. So he ends up sort of being depicted also as the second Columbus. He's the second European coming in to sort out the new world through these kinds of efforts, this kind of imperialism. And he's criticized at home for being an imperialist, of course. I like this one. He's looking at various hats and he's saying, I rather fancy this imported style imported from Europe. Of course, it's a crown. And then he's depicted also as crowning himself, saying, basically in French, I am the state, or the state is me. So we have this Emperor Roosevelt as part of the criticism. Now, he's criticized, of course, for what he did in taking the land from Columbia. And I like this response. He once commented to his Secretary of War, Root, he said, I took the isthmus. And Root responds, you certainly have, Mr. President. You've shown that you were accused of seduction, and you've conclusively proved that you are guilty of rape. L.A.U. Root was a great friend of Henry Flagler's, by the way. Great friend. And came to his funeral, I believe, here, his memorial service at Palm Beach in 1914. Flagler himself had lots to say about Teddy. I happened to be looking through his 1910 letter books and found these 2 observations about Teddy Roosevelt from Henry Flagler. He said, Teddy has a great many good and original things to say. The problem is that the good things are not original and the original things are not good. He also said, Roosevelt is like an empty barrel rolling on a sea of socialism. He really didn't appreciate the fact that Theodore Roosevelt tended to think that as a president he could do what needed to be done to set things right rather than working through the system of laws and rules. Of course, taking over that section of land, creating this separate state called Panama, means that the canal can be started, and we've got a picture here of Teddy Roosevelt making the dirt fly, as he said, to build the canal. And he becomes the first president to leave U.S. soil while he's a sitting president. He goes down to the canal zone and sits on one of these big steam shovels and has his picture taken and tours the canal zone. Here he is in his Panama whites sitting on one of these huge steam shovels. Well, this isn't all bad from Henry Flagler's point of view, because from Henry Flagler's point of view, he's had in his hip pocket this idea of building a railroad to Key West since at least 1891, probably since the 1880s. And he's had a charter, an exclusive charter with the Florida State Legislature to build such a railroad, but he's keeping it quiet. He didn't tell anybody, he didn't want to tip his hand. He learned that long ago. So he's waited until he thinks the canal is actually going to be built as an American project. And when that's announced, he quickly announces as well that he's going to Key West and he's going to build an Oversea Railroad. And then we would then have, of course, the nearest deep water port on American soil to the canal, to the east end of the canal. During his presidency, Roosevelt also managed to negotiate a treaty between the Russians and the Japanese. And as a consequence, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. So he's the first American president to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Pretty extraordinary. Of course, he finishes out his presidency, everything's going great. The problem is he served basically 2 terms. It's time to move on and honor Washington's example and not run for office again, although there's nothing stopping him from doing it. So he decides, well, you know what, I'll just sort of promote my own candidate, a guy named Taft. So there are pictured, Taft is the bride and Roosevelt as the bridesmaid. And so he set Taft up to get the nomination, and you can see it was a slam dunk according to Puck. They pictured Roosevelt here as a basketball player putting Taft through the goal, through the hoop. And indeed, Taft gets elected to continue Roosevelt's policies. In fact, and I love this cover of Puck, but here's Roosevelt leaving the White House with a porter carrying his big stick. He's handing over his baby, his policies, to Taft, who's dressed as a nursemaid. He's going to just take those policies and continue to care for them. The baby has little glasses on, just like Roosevelt, and has a little big stick. You see that in his hand? He's turning it over to Taft, confident that Taft is just going to follow his policies and do more of what he'd set out to do. And things go pretty well. Taft seems to do just that. So Theodore Roosevelt goes off to Africa for a world tour. He's going to take sort of a victory lap for being such a very popular and successful president. Winds up not long before he comes back to U.S. soil at the Sorbonne. And he gives this great speech. He's been hunting in Africa, and now he's in Europe, and he's being feted at various dinners and honored, and on and on. And he winds up giving this speech called The Citizenship in a Republic at the Sorbonne in Paris. And this is my favorite quote. Even though I have mixed feelings about Roosevelt, I can't quibble with this view of the world. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who is at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, who knows at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. He even speaks in metaphors that are all physical. It's amazing. Unfortunately, Taft didn't really follow the game book. And here they're pictured in Puck as a couple of schoolboys in a fight. They're with the Capitol in the background. Ironically, the problem is that Taft has decided to be more aggressive with the Sherman Antitrust Act, whereas Roosevelt has prosecuted or brought suit against 50 corporations in his 2 terms as president. Taft is already in 1 term gone after 75 corporations. And for Roosevelt, that was too much. In fact, he went back after J.P. Morgan for U.S. Steel as an antitrust suit. And for Roosevelt, that was too much. Roosevelt believed U.S. Steel was a good trust, not a bad trust. And it irritated him. So he got very irritated when Taft was being more Roosevelt than Roosevelt when it came to going after trusts. So he decides he wants to get back in the game again. And he's not going to worry about the tradition that Washington had set by serving only 2 terms. So we see this cartoon of the principal of the 3rd term in the form of the ghost of Washington pointing at Roosevelt, who's saying, I thought we put this behind us. I didn't think this was going to be an issue in my campaign. And of course, the Republican Party, they couldn't support this. They couldn't throw over Taft. They may have wanted to, but they couldn't throw over Taft. He was their guy. He'd already served 1 term as president. They weren't about to nominate somebody else at their convention. You see this great picture of the Republican Party as this elephant dressed, holding on to Taft and looking sorrowfully over a picture of Roosevelt. So they embrace Taft, but they can't embrace Roosevelt, though they might have wished to because he was so popular. And of course, there's all kinds of criticism. Was Roosevelt really ever a real Republican? maybe he was just dressed as a Republican. And of course, many people thought that he was bigger than the GOP. He was bigger than the Republican Party, that he carried more weight. Not to be deterred, Roosevelt decides to form a new third party, a third party that he called the Bull Moose Party. So we have this cartoon of Roosevelt as a moose arriving at the zoo. There's a latest arrival at the political zoo, it's called. He even poses riding a moose. This is crazy. And he goes out campaigning as a third party candidate. Here's one of his campaign platforms with a mounted head of a moose. And he does pretty well. I mean, in fact, here he is in Milwaukee campaigning, and he gets shot during this speech. It wasn't a fatal wound. It was, like they used to say in the old Westerns, just a flesh wound, apparently. He somehow determined that was the case and decided to continue his speech and goes on for another hour and a half, even though he's been shot. So, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. He doesn't get elected, of course. He does better than any third party candidate has ever done. I think Ross Perot, our last sort of semi-successful third party candidate, got 8% of the Electoral College. Roosevelt, I think, got 27%. He succeeds in splitting the conservative vote, or the Republican vote, I guess is a better way to say it at this time in our history, and it puts Wilson into the White House. So what does he do? He thinks, well, I need a great adventure. That's what I should do. And so he decides to put together a party to go find the headwaters of the Amazon River. Now, he's been all through Africa, but Africa is a child's play compared to South America in terms of disease, in terms of rough terrain, in terms of all kinds of challenges. But Roosevelt doesn't seem to know this. So what he does is he lands and he hikes across land to where he thinks the headwaters can be found, and then they're going to canoe down back to the ocean. But this would be about like a group of 19 of us landing in West Palm Beach, hiking to Chicago, only a lot worse terrain. We're really talking about a lot up and down, a lot of marshes, a lot of rain, a lot of really intense heat and humidity. And then canoeing down something like the Mississippi. Only imagine the Mississippi with all kinds of mountains that get in the way and waterfalls. You have to portage your canoe for miles and miles over land. It just becomes a crazy, crazy endeavor. So of the 19 people that start out, 16 of them make it home, which is amazing when you think about it. And there's a great book, by the way, by Candace Millard called River of Doubt, which we carry in the store. If you're interested in this story, you should really take a look at that book, because only somebody like Teddy Roosevelt could have pulled this thing off. He survives. They do make it. They did lose one member to a murder by another member of the party. Roosevelt's so sick. By the way, he picked up malaria during the Spanish-American War, so he's dealing with malaria. And I failed to mention that on one of his earlier campaign trips, he'd gotten into a collision with a trolley that killed his Secret Service agent and broke his leg and injured his leg so badly he had always had a bad leg for the rest of his life. And yet he still manages to survive this trip. At one point, when one of the party kills another, Roosevelt gets up off his sickbed. They thought he was going to die, as a matter of fact. He was so mad, and tries to hunt down the guy that shot the other person. Doesn't succeed, but he drives the guy far enough away that they just decide to abandon him. Because he was a murderer. They do see him across the river at one point. He pleads for their help, and they decide to ignore him and leave him to his fate. He survives this, but his health never recovers. He goes back to his home in Oyster Bay, and his health never recovers, and he dies at the age of 60. Relatively young. But he packed about 5 or 6 lifetimes in there, it seems to me, in the meantime. In the 1920s, there was an effort by the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Association to put a monument up in the mall. Let me just show you where it would have been. This is the kite plan you may have remembered from previous lectures. His monument would have gone at the bottom of this drawing, where the Jefferson Memorial is today, as a matter of fact. And the architect for this plan was none other than John Russell Pope. Now, you've heard me mention that name before, one of America's great architects. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. He married Mary Lily Keenan's girlfriend, so well known to the Flaglers, they named their daughter, he and his wife named their daughter Mary after Flagler's wife, Mary Lily Keenan. And he's a very successful architect. Here's a better layout. You can see down at the bottom of the page again where the tidal basin is and where the Jefferson Memorial is. That's where this monument to Roosevelt would have been. It's hard to get a sense of the scale here, but that, depending on the reports you read, that fountain was going to go up 200 to 280 feet high. So we're talking, you know, a football field vertically, at maybe as much as a football field vertically. And the colonnades on either side were as long as 2 football fields in a sort of semicircle and 60 feet high. The cornice of Whitehall, just as a comparison, is 40 feet high. So half again as tall as Whitehall, these columns. And the idea was to represent this incredible physical power that Roosevelt represented, and the fact that his mother and father united the North and South. His father was from the North, his mother was from the South, and we were still struggling had we mended our fences over the Civil War. And so they thought this monument would be a great symbol of all that. The problem was, it was estimated to cost $5 million, and another $5 million just to prepare the land around it. So it was a $10 million project in the mid-1920s. And even though our economy was booming in the 20s, they had a little trouble getting enough traction for that kind of investment. And it never happened. It didn't take place. But not long later, somebody came up with the idea of creating a monument at the American Museum of Natural History to honor Roosevelt. The state of New York decided to do that as a favored son. Now, this museum was chartered in 1869 in Theodore Roosevelt's father's living room. He was one of the founders of this museum. And in fact, Theodore Roosevelt donated one of its first collections items. He donated the skull of a red squirrel when he was 13 years old to the American Museum of Natural History. This is the entrance, the historical entrance. It's a Romanesque style building. It goes on to be, by the way, it's become a tremendous natural history museum that covers about 1.6 million square feet with 32 million specimens. They sponsor about 120 field trips a year. It's truly an extraordinary organization. If you visited, you may have seen this. This is the Willamette meteorite. This is a 15-ton meteorite found in the Willamette Valley. There are these great halls, like the Hall of African Mammals, with these incredible dioramas. One of these, the female elephant here was donated by Roosevelt's son, Kermit. This diorama of the mountain gorilla. Incredible. I love dioramas, but they're kind of considered old school these days, but these are really fantastic displays. And so the folks who want to create a monument to Roosevelt go out looking for an architect, and who do they come up with? John Russell Pope, the same one who proposed the monument for the mall in Washington. John Russell Pope had designed the National Archives, this building, Union Station in Richmond, Virginia. I'm showing these because you're going to see he has a pretty consistent style when it comes to monumental architecture. The National Gallery that Henry Mellon gave to this nation, and the Baltimore Museum of Art. And this crazy building, which I really love, this Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C. It's modeled after the tomb of Mausoleus at Halicarnassus, which is where we get the word mausoleum, by the way, and was considered, the original was considered one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Truly an extraordinary building. So John Russell Pope comes up with an entrance across from Central Park, a new entrance for the museum that is Beaux-Arts in style. And FDR, Teddy Roosevelt's distant cousin, lays the cornerstone in 1931 for this monument. And he recalled during his speech, during that ceremony, that Theodore Roosevelt had said to him, "Franklin, you can learn more about nature and life in the museum than on all the books and schools of the world." This new entrance was completed in 1936. Here's how it looks today. Definitely a Beaux-Arts facade, monumental in its architecture. This statue we'll talk more about in a minute was added later. It was designed by James Earl Fraser. Actually, to talk about it now. Here's another shot of it from the side to show its relationship to the entrance. On one side, there's an African acting as a guide for Theodore Roosevelt on this equestrian statue. This was cast by the way, by Gorham and Company in Providence, Rhode Island. And on the other side is another guide who's an American Indian. And these guides symbolize the North American continent and the African continents where Theodore Roosevelt so loved to collect natural history specimens, or as he called it, hunt. This is a picture of James Earl Fraser, the sculptor. Now, you probably know him better for the Buffalo Nickel, which he designed, one of my favorite coins, or the Trail's End statue, which is fairly well known. But he also designed a whole lot of other things for various monuments around the country, including the pediment for the National Archives, and these two statues outside the archives. This one is Heritage, and this one is Guardianship, that sit out on either side of the steps of the National Archives. Inside the American Museum of Natural History is a hall, Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Hall, which was described at the time as a Roman basilica. And Lorelei, here are the dinosaurs you were looking for, sweetheart. The big dinosaurs in the lobby there. And you can see on either side, can you see these plaques? Okay, so there are 4 big plaques on the ends of this hall with sayings or quotations from Roosevelt, which is a common thing to do in monuments. We see that at the Lincoln Memorial, we see it at the Jefferson Memorial, we don't see it at the Washington Memorial, or Washington Monument. There's another, and you can also see in this Roosevelt Memorial Hall these murals in the alcoves. Let's talk about the plaques and the murals. The 4 plaques are quotations, various quotations from Theodore Roosevelt. One about youth, and I'll give you a second to read those things. The last being my favorite, character in the long run is a decisive factor in the life of an individual and of nations alike. Manhood, the state, meaning the government. I like the last one again. If I must choose between righteousness and peace, I choose righteousness. This man didn't have a whole lot of doubt or uncertainty in his view of the world. And then nature. And again, I like the last of the quotes. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. Boy, that sounds kind of modern. It sounds kind of Republican. But, of course, he was a Republican. All right, and then the murals. We've got one mural that depicts him. There's a big competition held for these, by the way. And an artist named McKay won this competition. About 25 artists applied for this right to do the murals. Here he is hunting in Africa, well known for that, collecting specimens, many of which are at the American Museum of Natural History. Here he is negotiating the treaty between the Russians and the Japanese to end that war, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then in the third mural, he's depicted as sort of the architect of the Panama Canal and the person who wiped out yellow fever, or working with the doctors there to wipe out yellow fever in that part of the world. And then, of course, you have this intelligence, in case you're in any doubt what that is about. It's about the Panama Canal, but you have Panama represented in a female allegorical figure to the left, and America represented, or Colombia represented as a female allegorical figure to the right. So while this monument doesn't exist on the mall like the others that we're talking about during this lecture series, and while they had planned to recognize Theodore Roosevelt on the mall among the other great monuments, he wound up in New York being recognized with his own grand entrance to the American Museum of Natural History. Did they get it right? I think they got it right. And I'll tell you why. This museum attracts about 5 million visitors a year. Second only, and not only because of the huge rallies held on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, second only to the Lincoln Memorial. Far superior to the attendance to the Jefferson Memorial, and far superior to the attendance of the Washington Memorial. And far superior to the attendance of Mount Rushmore. So Roosevelt is recognized through this monument to a broader audience each year than the other memorials, and in some cases, I guess more than Rushmore and Jefferson memorials combined, and Washington Memorial. I guess you could put those three memorials together and more people see this memorial to Roosevelt than see those three combined. So I think they got it right. I think it's a great memorial to the president who really represents the active, physical, assertive side of the American character. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions I can entertain for you or try to answer for you? Yes?
There's that picture of them on the bull moose. That's an actual photograph?
I think so. It's sure, you know, they weren't as good at doctoring images as they are today. And I think that's a real picture. And there are several versions of that as well. Yes?
Is one of the reasons that he is a conservationist that they used to think the people that hunted, they cared about keeping the population healthy so that there would be animals to hunt, rather than just wiping out?
Yeah, I think the last question, by the way, was that a real picture of him riding a bull moose? I think it was. This next question is about this relationship between hunting and conservation, and did the hunters see themselves as somehow involved in a positive way in maintaining populations or healthy populations of animals? And in fact, that's exactly the case, and it's still the case. And the Boone and Crockett Club is still oriented that way. Some of the greatest conservationists in the world started out as hunters and would love to continue to hunt, but won't hunt because the populations have been eroded by too much hunting or other causes or loss of habitat or whatever. And certainly the president of this museum, who used to fish internationally on a world-class level for tuna, giant tuna, and who's in the International Game Fishing Hall of Fame, would tell you, you don't ever keep billfish, for example, because they're too threatened. Though he's a great game fisherman, he considers himself a conservationist as well. And so people like Muir would have probably hunted as well as Audubon and Burroughs and others. There just wasn't that clean division that we think of today, for sure. So another question over here.
Did they ever think of incorporating anything about Roosevelt, the National Museum of History in Washington?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I don't know that they did. I think this came along relatively early enough, and the other plan was the only thing that got attention really in Washington itself. And I think this museum in New York was further along in its development at that point too. I'm not positive of that, but it's certainly become the premier natural history museum, although I'm sure we could argue over that. God knows I'll get a phone call over it sooner or later.
How did the two museums compare? The one in Washington is smaller, isn't it?
I think it is, but I couldn't tell you the specifics, I'm sorry. Yes, there's a question online.
Being as active as he was, how did he maintain his wealth?
Being as active as he was, how did he maintain his wealth? Well, that's a good question. He was often a guest for some of these things as well, but he was born into a relatively privileged family, so he wasn't any good as a businessman. He didn't need to be. And then as president, he had a lot of invitations, a lot of privilege, but he did struggle. I mean, what helped him, I think, toward the end of his life, maintain at least a decent standard of living for his family was he was such a prolific writer, and he was such huge demand. So he ended up writing more than 20 books. He lectured a lot and was paid for that as well after his presidency. So, he started out doing fine, and then he was president and did fine through invitations and being a guest and so forth. And then later in life, there were people willing to fund him, like in his trip to South America, and he was able to fund himself through various other enterprises like writing articles, and he wrote thousands of magazine articles, for example, and books. But he did struggle a little bit toward the end to maintain and leave his family enough money to survive after his death. By the way, when he died, the comment from the Vice President of the United States at the time, he died in his sleep. The comment from the Vice President at the time was, it's a good thing he died in his sleep. It's a good thing death came for him in his sleep. Because if he hadn't, there would have been a fight. Any other questions? Yes?
There's a fairly clever palindrome. A man
guest just mentioned that the palindrome. You know what a palindrome is, everyone? It reads the same as forwards as back. Bob is the simplest palindrome there is. If you spell it backwards, it still says Bob, right? But the one they came up with for the Panama Canal was a man, a plan, a canal. A man, a plan, a canal, Panama. So if you write that out and write all those letters backwards, it'll say the same thing, providing you put the spaces in the right place. Absolutely, yes.
My uncle Joe Ostenkemp was a bodyguard with Teddy Roosevelt in Milwaukee when he was shot.
Wow.
And he informed me that he was shot point blank. And what saved him was that he had a speech, which he had about 50 papers, I believe, as I was told the story, that were folded over, plus the fact that he had a glasses case that was iron rimmed, and the bullet was impeded by this, although it did permeate the skin.
Yes.
And he went ahead with the speech
Right.
despite all this.
So the comment was that one of the members of the audience had an uncle who was a bodyguard for Teddy Roosevelt when he was shot in Milwaukee, and that he was saved by the fact that he had like 50-page speech folded up in his pocket and a thick glasses case, which really slowed the bullet down and resulted in less damage to the tissue. Maybe the only time in history where a long speech saves someone's life. All right, well, thank you so much for coming today.